I'm going to ask Fran Boyd to come on up first to talk about this issue. And Fran, you want to come on up?
I've been asked to basically sit on the panel to talk a little bit about this and just to give a perspective of how of the legislative background and language that came about. And it's language that occurred in the previous Farm Bill on their labeling of domestic and imported lamb and mutton. Came about at the time where there was a major concern in the industry about imported lamb coming to the United States and the age of imported lamb coming to the United States. The definition, as you know, AMS does a grading definition, and FSIS, Food Inspection Safety Service, does the actual definition of what is lamb. The language, which I have and you have in the report, language that went with it, basically called for the Secretary to investigate and do a study to see how we should proceed. Where we are today, primarily because of a lot of issues going on at the department and others, there has not been any movement on that area, as I understand. It's sitting there, and I guess it's something to discuss here as a group, whether we wish to ask the department to move forward in this area or not. So, you want to take a question, or just how should I do this? Maybe we'll wait till the end? Okay, very good. Okay.
Thanks, Fran. You saved us a little time there. Anyway, next we're going to have Dr. Lawrence Yates come on up.
Okay, in essence, what the grading function does, it is a voluntary service. It doesn't address all the lambs that are slaughtered. In essence, there's 3 classes that graders do consider, and that's lamb, yearling mutton, and mutton. Clearly within the lamb category, there's 2 maturity categories. There's a category A and then there's a category B, with the category B being determined primarily from rib, texture and lean characteristics, and color of the lean. So as far as yearling mutton is concerned, that deals more with break joints and spool joints, and likewise in mutton, that's entirely spool joints. USDA, what's been posted on ASI's website with regard to this discussion and some of the documents is procedures that USDA uses in grading. Now, USDA also offers other procedures, for example, that would allow plant personnel where it would be an audited program that one could at least classify based on the joint configurations. That may be an opportunity available. Also, there could be another auditable program that might be available to USDA if the logistics can be worked out with FSIS, is on the emergence of adult teeth. So that's another opportunity that might be available. How that's handled, it would be just more of a marketing issue rather than a grading issue per se, but it's something, a service that AMS can offer. So I'll just leave it there.
Dr. Zerby, would you like to come on up?
What I'd like to tell you, and they asked me to kind of look through some of the literature and take a look at some of this stuff from a maturity standpoint and how it applies to grading systems. And, I'm a member of the industry as well as an academic person. So the first thing I'm going to tell you, you need to know a little bit about where I'm coming from. And I think there's 2 enemies in this room, and they're probably not who you think they are. First of all, greed and tradition. And there are some very strong traditional values that are very good in the land ministry that we need to hold on to. But our willingness, or our unwillingness to change or even consider change in a lot of ways has led us to some of the places we are. It's important to remember when we talk about quality grading and maturity that right now it's coupled with yield grading. Those 2 things happen together. So those 2 things happen to happen at the same time. So as we go through this discussion, it's important to think about, where does grading take place in the plant? And there are some potential changes that could happen with yield grading system that may change where quality grading takes place, which may come in part of the discussion of some of the things that Dr. Yates just mentioned. Very important to keep that in the back of your mind. Other things that I would encourage you to think about as you start to ask questions. What do you want your quality grading system to do? How do we use it currently? What do you want it to predict? Right now, in lamb, as he said, we have 3 grades. In lamb, then we have 4 divisions within there. We have prime, we have choice, we have good, we have utility. We apply those things, but if we don't like the grade that's on it, we don't have to roll it. So we have basically being utilized a 2-class system, acceptable and unacceptable. Prime and choice are acceptable, everything else, no roll, unacceptable. That's at that market segment in the supply chain. As we move on down to the retailer, how many of you guys actually go into a store and see what's on those packages and what's being advertised out there? How often do you see prime or choice on that label? In the retail store, is our quality grade system actually distinguishing product? So we can have all these debates about these changes and things like that, but if we're not going to utilize the system, or we don't want to know what the system is going to be utilized for, it's empty rhetoric, which we've tended to do from time to time. So just keep that in the back of your mind. I've dug through some of the literature, and interestingly enough, ASI asked an independent group of 2 very respected meat scientists to go out and look at maturity. In 1973, I believe that report was. And their recommendation, they came back, was that chronological age was a better indicator of maturity than break joints. I've reviewed the literature since that point in time, and guess what? It says the same thing. Now there's pros and cons to that. We are the only country right now using break joints in our system. And we do have the shape and color of ribs, and we do talk about the color of the flank, and we do talk about flank streaking, and we do have some of those things to adjust some of those things. Remember how these things are happening, and we're talking about line speed, and we talk about lean coarseness and fineness. That's if we rib a lamb. We don't rib lambs. You just heard Erica talk about some of the things that we do are outdated and don't make sense. Well, our quality grading system might be part of that. 1992, we had changes. We've had several changes to the quality grading system. 1992, there was a change, and it took leg score out of yield grade and put it over into quality grade. Took confirmation, moved them over there. Those are really yield things. So we started sticking things in the quality grade that predict more yield and stuff like that. I'm not in total disagreement with that, because as I listen to retailers talk, quality to them means something different. They're not just talking about palatability. They're talking about how much seam fat and waste fat's in that. And so they can say that some of those things are applicable. Some of the things we do are very different. I just challenge you to understand the system and how it's applied before you go and want to make sweeping changes to it, and make sure the effort we go to is constructive. Maturity does play a role. It does change color. We know that consumers buy on appearance. As animals get older, they tend to get more myoglobin, and the color gets darker. We use lean as the thing that we talk about in the grading standard. Right now, we're predicting that with flank. Understand that because we don't do certain things, we don't break things certain ways, and I'm not saying that we should. Sometimes we're using predictors of predictors to estimate the final outcome. And every time you take a step away from that, your accuracy goes down quite a bit. Okay? Flavor is another very important aspect. If you guys look at what the lamb board's putting out there right now in the promotional material, and one of their slogans, it's based on flavor. We don't tend to talk a lot about flavor changes. And we know from the science that over time, as these lambs get older, they will increase the concentration of branch change fatty acids in there, and those are the same things that cause off flavors and mutton type flavors in these animals. So maturity does play a role. Doesn't matter whether it's grass-fed or grain-fed, time on feed, and how old these guys are, we see in the evidence in the literature that flavor comes up. The big one, the sexy one everybody likes to talk about is tenderness, okay? And I can find you data in the literature that would say tenderness, we can go out to 2 years old in these guys, 3 years old in these guys, we don't see a big difference. And I can see data out there that says once we get past, 12, 14 months, we start to see differences. And it depends on how the study was done. We tend to see a lot of research out there that focuses on the loin, the longissimus dorsi muscle, the racks in the loins. Well, unfortunately, that's not the only thing we have to sell out of these carcasses. And when we look at the literature that's on racks and loins, yes, it would say that as these lambs get older and even up into 2 years old, we don't have as much deterioration in tenderness as you might expect. But if we look at the literature that talks about legs and the other parts of the carcass, after we get past that 14, 15-month period, we do start to see a deterioration in quality. And it has to do with the muscle structure, it has to do with the collagen, it has to do with the amount and the cross-linking in that collagen, which then also impacts what we don't often think about. And one of the benefits we have of our supply system is built-in aging time as this product's moving through the distribution channel. But these older lambs and many of these muscles don't age as fast or as well. And so not only are we not getting the initial benefit in tenderness, we're not getting the increasing response in tenderness over time as well. So I just want to lay out some of those things where maturity comes back to. And if you look at the literature, there is a very different aspect between break joints and dentition. The literature would tell you that if we look at the studies that are out there, about half the animals, about 14, 15 months of age, regardless of gender, will have eruption of the first two incisors in that point in time. The other half won't, but soon after they will. So it's pretty accurate. Some of the studies suggest that ewe lambs are a little bit ahead of the wethers on dentition, on tooth eruption, by about 9 days, a week to 2 weeks. If we look at break joints, ewe lambs will produce spool joints at about that same period of time. Several studies out there demonstrate that wethers won't produce, at least a high percentage of wethers, not all of them, but a high percentage of wethers don't produce break joints until we start getting into 22 months of age. There's a market difference. And so intuitively right now you're saying, well, why are we using that system? And maybe we should go for change. Well, be careful what you ask for. Everybody wants to go to a value-based system, and we could utilize this stuff in a value-based system. We can utilize some of the new technology coming down in a value-based system. I just caution some of you guys out there, producers. In a value-based system, and I've studied a lot of them, worked with a lot of them, you make money in a value-based system if you produce above-average lambs. In every talk I've given, I don't care if it's been to sheep producers, beef producers, or pork producers, when I ask who out there is producing below-average animals, no one raises their damn hand. A value-based system will eat you alive if you're not producing above average. So be cautious. Be careful what you wish for. If we go to dentition, and it's not my choice whether we do or we don't, I'm here to lay out some of the pros and cons. If we go to dentition, what's it going to do to the supply of choice and prime lambs? Because we have some wethers out there that probably aren't going to make it anymore. And as we saw in some of these slides, supply is an issue. But there are pros and there are cons to all that kind of stuff. Just want you to think a little bit about that. I'll stop there before I dig holes and let you guys ask questions.
Tell you what, I'm going to ask Dr. Zerby, Dr. Yates, and I think Peter's going to fill in for Fran. And we're going to allow just probably about 10, 15 minutes for questions, because we got to kind of keep moving, because Dr. Yates is also, and maybe you were going to speak about tenderness new, and I know on the second part, and I know Henry touched on that. So I don't know if you want to combine that in with this question format, or if you want to present a little something else on, and we could have a little longer time for.
Yeah, that may be useful.
Okay, and then we could.
Because Henry pretty much has introduced it.
Yeah, so why don't we just combine that into this kind of question and answer and panel session as well? Maybe you want to touch on that a little bit. And Peter and Henry, could you come on up as well?
Maturity and tenderness, and quality grade and yield grade, in the lamb industry, they're all related. Like Henry said, once you put confirmation with quality grade, that kind of confounds what yield grade and quality grade means and how that could be useful. Okay, Henry did an excellent introduction to this. How do you communicate value? Oftentimes, when we communicate, our best talks, our best communication comes when we have shared values. When my kids go to the grocery store and my wife, I always get a call, if there's a choice or between two, what's better, prime or choice? On the beef side, is select better than choice? Which one's it? What does yield grade really mean? As we communicate, yes, from a producer to a packer, we both share the values of what a yield grade is and what a quality grade is. But what does it really mean to a consumer? How do they wrap their heads around it? And so if you're trying to communicate value and you're trying to get some kind of return on value, how do you do that? Well, eating satisfaction is probably probably three major factors: tenderness, flavor, and juiciness. As far as quality grade, though, if we looked at it, we use that as a palatability indicating characteristics of the lean, flank streaking, firmness, and maturity, but these don't really explain the variation that define lamb eating satisfaction. Tenderness and flavor have been identified as the primary determinants of eating satisfaction, and so the question becomes, how is this communicated? Well, the beef industry is probably pulled ahead. They've looked at this for a little bit over 15 years, and it's coming to a culmination. In essence, we've established, through working with the beef industry, a beef tenderness standard, and it's a marketing claim. In essence, the beef industry came to us and said we wanted to have a tenderness marketing claim. We've held various forums, various discussions with working groups composed of producers, grocery stores, packers, purveyors, and so in essence, a draft standard was developed in 2009, but because of Act of Congress in 1995, in essence, what Congress said is that the government is devising standards that may not get the best input from industry. And so what we want USDA to do in this case is to work with industry and come up with a consensus standard. In order to do that, Congress pretty much said you don't do it in-house, you do it outside of the house, and you work with voluntary standard groups. USDA chose the American Society for Testing and Materials. Packers and Stockyards has a lot of experience working with this group, and we as well with regard to instrument grading. As far as the tenderness standard goes, there's two primary committee, or one major committee. It's referred to as the Livestock, Meat, and Poultry Evaluation Systems, and under that there's a subcommittee, the Livestock, Meat, and Poultry Marketing Claims, of which I'm chair. So you've got it in there. As far as standard, it was approved in 2011, and so in essence, it's a standard specification for tenderness marketing claims associated with meat cuts derived from beef. In essence, they have two claim options. One is tender and one's very tender, and they're based on mechanical measurements of tenderness, that being shear force value. Warner-Bressler shear is one term, and slice shear force is the other. In essence, the way it's implemented, the way that the industry is moving to putting this in place, we have pretty much the ASTM standard. We use the American Meat Science Association Cooking and Evaluation as a standard, and then USDA couples those two standards and procedures with something that we're comfortable with that will work with industry. In essence, once all those three are passed, those hurdles are met, then they can use a USDA tender standard. In essence, the operational requirements, that what we have devised is performance-based. A company has to declare what standard they're going to use. For example, if there is to be a sheep or a lamb standard, then that's what they would declare. It's a quality management approach, which means that they have the management, they have the documented results, and all those actions are traceable, and that it can be statistically verified. Now, companies are approved on a case-by-case basis. It's through an audit-based program. In essence, the audit frequency is about twice a year. And to move on again, we review marketing promotional materials to make sure that they're consistent with the standards. Shield use is granted for use with products that are certified tender. And then you've got the marketing and promotional, and then, of course, FSI labeling approval. So the question is, how do you want to communicate standard? And Henry, again, had a great introduction. What's of a value to a consumer? What do they think? What do they want? What do your foreign countries want? What are they looking for? Would this be useful? And so with the instrument grading study, CSU also had 300 loin samples they had taken from these, that instrument grading study that was done in cooperation with ASI. And so in essence, they looked at Warner-Bressler shear force, and the primary difference that they saw, and it was with regard to the beef tenderness standard, not a significant difference, was that the yield grade 1 carcasses had a somewhat tougher or a higher Warner-Bressler shear force, which would translate to a little bit tougher. But other than that, the shear force values were essentially the same from all the other yield grades. There's no seasonality effect, and there's no interaction between yield grade and seasonality. They also conducted consumer sensory panels, and in essence, they had a sheet, and what they evaluated was three overall attributes that they like or dislike for tenderness, flavor, and overall acceptability. In essence, you guys are floating. Consumer sensory ratings did not differ for samples from yield grades or season. There was no interaction. And in essence, consumers found that American lamb was acceptable 90% of the time. And this is for, again, primarily choice and prime. There's no, as far as off flavor, as far as flavor, 69% of samples for yield grade 1s were acceptable. And for the other yield grades, it went up to 81%. Overall acceptability was 80%. In essence, you're over 80% for everything. So that's the good news. If you were to put those Warner breasts with shear force under the standards for the beef, in essence, 99% of all the samples there would be, of course, tender and also, of course, very tender. So the question is, how do you want to communicate? Paul had came to me and said, this is something the lamb industry might be interested in, might be able to use. And so, in essence, we need to get a working group. If you're interested, how do you want to communicate tenderness? What levels? On the beef side, we take one shear force value or a quality program that says we're going to measure the equivalent of the loin, and there are certain cuts that are always correlated with that, and that group would be collectively or would reflect a tenderness claim. Likewise, with regard to Henry's comments, what other cuts that do relate to that type of tenderness and what might be useful and how you market lamb. Available pathways, the tenderness standard, of course, this is what we've discussed. I'm also a member of another committee on sensory claims through ASTM, and in essence they have a standard sensory guide for sensory claim substantiation, and that's something the USDA could also facilitate the industry as long as you have a defined case of circumstances that influences flavor. And so if you wanted to go that route, in essence, you could have a tenderness standard and a flavor standard, and those would be certified. That's it.
All right, great, thank you. We have about, you know, I always knew this was a tender group, but we, did you like that? But we have about 10 minutes for questions before we're going to move into our policy forum. So this is questions for our panelists, and if anybody has a question, I'd ask them to just stand up, and Amy has a mic.
The question was, can some of the output from instrument grading be used for the palatability or as far as tenderness? And it was a limited sample, and the study was devised based on yield grade or cutability more so than quality grade. It turns out quality grade was just, it fell out. I mean, it was apparent. We didn't have the depth or spread in data that could really address that question. I wish we would have had. I would, you know, hindsight's always better than foresight. So,
Just let me add to that we don't think that it'll do much for palatability because we really have a hard time predicting palatability. But understand that not everybody thinks that the quality grade system is simply around palatability. And some of the stuff we heard yesterday is suggesting that it's pretty accurate on carcasses, but also pretty accurate on subprimals and primals. May be of benefit, particularly to the retailers who are worried about seam fat and things like that. What was really exciting that I heard about that was that it was had some pretty good accuracies around it on primals, and so that could make some major improvements.
I think you already answered my question, but is there a relationship between tenderness and flavorfulness?
the data that CSU had, and I meant there's other days, there's somewhat a thing, but I meant desirability is a balance of what's desirable and what's undesirable. And once you start getting the mature issues and how Henry addressed it, you'll get some of that that'll drive, you know, would the yield grade 1 effect, would that might due to a lack of juiciness, might do a lack of fat and lack of flavor, or likewise you could have incidents where you've got that muttony taste where a lot of consumers find that objectionable, they weren't raised with it, so.
Inherently there is, but inherently there isn't. And that's what makes this subject so fun. You know, as we get older, you know, we tend to get higher branch change fatty acid levels. We're going to change flavor profiles, and diets are going to change flavor profiles. As they tend to get older and more mature, we're also going to change some tenderness applications. You know, we get into different calpostatin level activities with maturity. We get into different collagen levels. The other thing we have to remember is when we ask consumers to evaluate tenderness, evaluate flavor, we have objective ways of doing that. We're doing that subjectively. And we get into what we call the halo effect. And we know, you know, we always try to put all this data out there on means, and we give you an average. And what you have to pay attention to also are thresholds and the distribution around that mean, because the mean might be damn, you know, acceptable. But if we look at the variation around, there's a certain percentage that's below a threshold. And if that percentage is always getting a negative eating experience and we're losing them, we're eroding market share. And so we have to be careful just looking at means. The halo effect is if they have a tender product, they're also going to associate it to have poor flavor, because humans just don't discriminate as well as objectivity does. And so there is, the way we measure it sometimes, inherent correlations. Typically positively correlated in terms of evaluating sensory responses, in terms of how panelists rate things because of the halo effect. I'm not saying scientifically they are. I'm saying when people evaluate products, we know from looking at how they evaluate them, if it's more tender, they also tend to rate it juicier. They also tend to rate it more flavorful. And so we have some of that bias.
Is there a validity to what we always hear that, for instance, if I take my 9-month-old Katahdin and put it up against a 9-month-old Hampshire lamb, my Katahdin tastes better? Or is that somebody's imagination?
Depends if you're asking. It depends if you're asking a Katahdin breeder or a Hampshire breeder. That's my experience.
Categorize, same with cattle to age and source verification. Would that program help us in finding the yield grade ages that we would like to have hit the market? Or are we just going to always deal with old fat lambs that nobody bought at the right time?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be similar to what we find in the beef industry as far as the 20-month. And yes, it would be helpful, but again, you're putting a reporting burden on the producer, and then the trucker who comes in, he's got to make sure he passes that paperwork on, and then the plant has the burden of saying, yeah, this is what. So that's a viable opportunity, but it takes those segments, and those segments have to be verified. So
I have wondered for a long time, and Dr. Yates and Dr. Zerby, you could probably answer on the age source verification. If we have lambs out there that are not turning into mutton until they are, you know, an aged larger frame wether lamb, do we have the data available to look at the palatability, the tenderness on that right hand of that bell curve? I know we've got the tenderness studies, but I don't believe we've covered that extreme end, and we've seen more of that extreme end coming to market in the last year. So I'm kind of curious what is out there for data, and is that a hole in the data that we may need to look at as an industry?
There is some data out there. You guys won't like it because it's not yours, but Australia's looked at that quite a bit. And there's always the argument from the producers in the United States that they have a different production system, they use different genetics, and that's true. But I think the general trends that we see are utilizable. So there is some data there. Would you want to verify it or substantiate it with some of our genetics and some of our production systems? Probably so, but we can dig through the literature and get some ideas towards that. Keep in mind, you guys want this one rule or this rule that's going to solve all these problems you're dealing with. We know We can take these lambs heavy, we can take these lambs light, but it's just as important to keep them on a positive nutritional plane throughout that time. Once you dump that nutritional plane, and when you're putting lambs and you get into these high feed costs and you have to hold them for a while, what kind of diets are you feeding them? I don't know. Are you keeping them on the same diet, or are you slowing down protein turnover? Biologically, your body's turning over all the time. You guys want muscle to be this magic tissue out there that's juicy and flavorful and tender all the time. Mother Nature created it for contraction and heat. And you're asking it to do miraculous things. A lot of it's in your hands and keeping these guys in a positive nutritional plane from beginning to end. And keep in mind, if we start using this VIA system and we start targeting heavy muscle, fast-growing lambs, the literature tells us those lambs tend to be tougher because indirectly we start selecting for mutations like the Carwell effect and the Calipese gene. So there's not a freaking silver bullet, and there's not going to be any one standard that we're going to develop that's going to solve the issues out there. Sorry.
You tell him, Henry. Okay. Okay. One more question, Dennis.
I'll direct this to the scientists up there, since. But I think we can talk about the grading, but the data that Dr. Yates presented said we really don't have a tenderness problem. We have some variability in tenderness that we deal with. We really don't have a grading problem. We have a fat problem. That's what the industry really has. And that's what we ought to be talking about and addressing. And relative to the source verification, great marketing tool. You're either going to sell your product on price or you're going to sell it on differentiation. Decide which way you want to go. We know what price does.
I think this industry has a chance to have the red meat health food. And I think what you ought to be doing is asking the health people what they're recommending. If you go to NIH and pull lamb up, it has the best omega-3, omega-6 balance. The second thing that they'll tell you is it's New Zealand range lamb or Australian range lamb. Nothing about American lamb on the NIH site. Okay? I go to the doctor, I'm older, I need it. These people are telling us we only need red meat once a week. If you eat lamb once a week, that's a lamb carcass. There's your chance. But what do we want for a health food? You know, we can talk about tenderness, and I agree with fatness. We don't need fatness. Henry's already said that. We have tenderness, we have flavor and everything without fat. He tries to put fat in the pigs because they don't have the muscle in the loin because they selected too much for leanness. Think about what is the medical industry telling the patients in the integrated health programs. And I'll tell you, they're telling you something that isn't up here today.
Thank you. All right.